She has a nose ring, Steve. I love it. I love it. Anyway, go on. I was just thinking about that.
Welcome to Unqualified Opinion, the podcast equivalent of monkeys throwing rocks at each other. How's it going, Scott?
Steve, that's one of the most original openings I've heard. I love that. I'm doing really well. Just got back from a date that I think went okay, so I'm feeling in an okay mood. And for those of you who haven't listened to this podcast before, know that we start out by describing the drinks that we're having, and they're always something a little bit different. So to start out with, I'm drinking it. It's beer. But I think the unusual thing about this is it's actually a can of beer that is about three times larger than a normal can of beer. It's like a mini keg. So it's a little hard to hold in my hand because the circumference is so big. That is
wow. That really just gets right to the point, right? What's the company? Black Stack.
Black Stack? Yep.
What kind of beer?
It is it's an IPA. It is described as hazy, juicy, and soft. So all I know, it has a 7% alcohol content. So it's quite
Have you tried
good.
it? Is it any good?
Oh yeah. I had. This is actually the beer I drank earlier today on the date, and yeah, it makes you feel good.
Great, as all alcohol should.
So
I am going, trying to recover from a spree of days of drinking. I think since the last time we talked, I've gone one day without drinking, and it's been a little bit rough. So I'm trying to take it easy today and not get too heavy into it. So I actually have in front of me some Tazo Wild Sweet Orange Tea, and I figured this podcast wouldn't be the same without alcohol. So I'm going to try to splash some, I cannot pronounce this, Domaine de Caton. I butchered that. It's a French ginger liqueur into this Tazo tea, and then see how that goes. This is a new attempt. Let's see what happens here.
So for those of you who can't see this, which is everyone except Steve and I, the bottle he has is about the size of his head, and I will bet the listeners that if it is full by the end of this podcast, something's not right in the universe. It probably is going to be mostly gone.
That tastes like some kind of medication. Oh. Like if you're having a flu or something and you need to drink some kind of warm or like a cough syrup.
Yeah.
It'll
grow on you.
I like it a lot, actually.
Yeah, of course you'll do it. It has alcohol in it.
It's great. It's pretty great. I recommend it. I can't pronounce the name of this thing.
Is it some sort of Japanese thing?
No, it's a French thing.
A French thing. Oh. Domaine de Canton.
There we go.
That literally means domain of Canton.
What an unoriginal name. I'm going to add a little bit more.
Yeah, Steve.
It's the best way to drink tea.
You should probably just add a little bit of tea to that bottle.
Yeah, just get right to it. All right. So for today's episode, we thought that we'd have a little discussion about immortality and the, in my opinion, severe lack of research into immortality currently, and also whether or not investing time and research into immortality is ultimately for society's benefit. And you know, this is just a fun little conversation we're going to have. I have a strong opinion. I believe strongly that we should be trying to change public discourse to view immortality research more favorably, and that we should be investing more money into it generally as a society. And I actually don't know what Scott's position is, but my hope is that I can convince him the validity of my argument and, try to answer any critiques he might have.
Well, this is a really interesting debate because it goes to the extremity of a debate that has happened for some years now, probably since the successful cloning of Dolly the sheep back in, I think it was the early 90s, if I'm not mistaken. And it is a debate that centers around how much modification can, and a different question is, should one make, or science make, to the human body to enhance it. And it goes everything from Dolly the sheep and the promise of cloning to, logically the next step would be cloning of organs for those who are sick, and then now discussions are around, and recently in the news, it's around changing the genome of embryos to modify how they will be, and to some levels on a molecular level when they are born. In this debate, this is not a debate about whether or not it is a good thing to reproduce in an artificial manner certain components of a human. This is not an argument about that. That's a different argument for a different time. It doesn't take place here. This, and that's why I say this is on the extremity, and that's why it's very interesting. It's the extremity of the debate, the longevity of a human life into infinity. That is where this debate is. It's on the very fringe of science, sort of pseudoscience, if you will. So in that way, it's actually a very interesting debate because it's so out there. And my opinion is it's completely ludicrous.
So I wanted to start by telling a story that was written by a philosopher named Nick Bostrom. He also wrote the book Superintelligence, if anyone wants to look into that, to look at the possible issues of developing superhuman AI. But this story was a short one. If you look it up online, it's called The Fable of the Dragon Tyrant. You can find it. CGP Grey, a YouTuber, also makes a great YouTube video adaptation of this. And so there were great resources to try to find this story online. I'm going to attempt to quickly summarize it, and will most likely butcher significant parts of it. So go find the actual sources and read those instead, or find CGP Grey's video. It's great. There's a story that Nick Bostrom wrote, and it goes something like this. Let me take a quick sip here. So there was a time when the planet was controlled by a giant dragon. The king and his kingsmen tried very hard to fight this dragon, to fight it off. They using the most cutting-edge weapons that they had, but the dragon's fire, its claws, and its scales were too tough for any of the soldiers in the king's land. It demanded that every evening 10,000 people were delivered to it as a tribute. Even though people tried to fight the dragon to resist this demand, it was too strong and its armor was too tough. So the people had to obey. Eventually, over time, the dragon became a part of life. Kids were taught that the dragon is inevitable, and not only that, the fact that the dragon exists really gives life meaning. Because if it weren't for an end at the jaws of the dragon, what real value is there in life? Others argued that it was important to the society, that it was necessary to keep the population down. Spiritual men would try to comfort people by making promises of a life after the feeding, that this was really just the beginning. Over time, as the society grew, the dragon grew bigger. It demanded more people every year to feed it. And at this point, the king, rather than being preoccupied by the number of deaths every day at the dragon's jaws, cared more about the logistics of how to feed the dragon. How do we get people to the dragon? How do we build systems There were dragonologists who were hired to figure out these logistics, and some of them even started to research the fundamental properties of the dragon, looking at its claws, looking at its scales, and realized once again how invincible the dragon was. However, as these dragonologists continued their research, some of them found that there may be a sliver of hope in finding a material hard enough to pierce its scales and kill the dragon. The king's scholars dismissed this idea, pointing to historical records of the dragon's previous victories and saying there's no way humans could ever fight back. Eventually, a group of anti-dragon dragonists began to organize and petition the king for research into killing the dragon. Eventually, the king allowed for a meeting in the largest hall of the royal castle. The anti-dragonists say that it would be hard work, it would be dangerous work, but the science is promising. There's no guarantee, but in 10 to 15 years, maybe there is a chance to kill the dragon. And then the chief moralist of the king stood up and gave his speech. And at this point, I'm actually going to go to the speech because I think it's really poignant and helpful. So let me just pull that up. He said this of the scientist: "Let us grant that this woman is correct about the science and that the project is technologically possible, although I don't think that has actually been proven. Now she desires that we get rid of the dragon. Presumably she thinks she's got the right not to be chewed up by the dragon. How willful and presumptuous. The finitude of human life is a blessing for every individual, whether he knows it or not. Getting rid of the dragon, which might seem like such a convenient thing to do, would undermine our human dignity. The preoccupation with killing the dragon will deflect us from realizing more fully the aspirations to which our lives naturally point, from living well rather than merely staying alive. It is debasing, yes, debasing for a person to want to continue his or her mediocre life for as long as possible without worrying about some of the higher questions about what life is to be used for. But I tell you, the nature of the dragon is to eat humans, and our own species-specified nature is truly and nobly fulfilled only by getting eaten by it." At this point, while everybody stood in silence trying to comprehend these words, one little boy in the crowd said, "No, the dragon is bad." Although the parents tried to hush the child stood up and spoke more loudly. "The dragon is bad. The dragon ate my granny. I want my granny back. The dragon eats people. It's bad." At this point, other people started to stand up. "The dragon ate my wife, ate my son. The dragon ate my parents." And as the weight of all of the debts the dragon has caused dawned on everybody, it became clear that they had to do something. And so, the project was undertaken. More funding was found. People started to get an interest. And 12 years later was the day of the launch. And as they got ready for the launch, one man in the crowd stumbled up to the king and said, "You have to stop the last train. My father is on that train. Please, you need to call it off." And the king fell down to his knees and said, "I'm so sorry. We cannot stop it. It is too late. If only we started just one day earlier, your father and all those other people could have been saved. But we were too foolish, and we didn't take the step. And so now they have to die while we are given the privilege of living." The missile was launched, the dragon was killed, and the biggest question that humanity could finally ask was, what's next? So that's the story. It's called The Fable of the Dragon Tyrant. I took a little bit of artistic license and I skipped a few parts, but there's some really good points in there, and I think there are a few main morals I want to touch on. And so the first one is that the fact that death is so prevalent in our lives now has made it become this simple fact of life, that we take the notion of death for granted. This is in the same way that a lot of diseases have in the past and even today been taken for granted. But as we find technological solutions, we've found ways to get past them. And maybe we can start by discussing that topic, or at least let me hear your thoughts.
Well, that's an interesting story. I've heard it before. It's a long story. I think the bottom. Well, there's several bottom lines. There's actually about 25 bottom lines as I was listening. But I think one of the bottom lines is, and well, first off, it is really a poor idea to base an entire philosophy off of one heuristic, off of one story. So just in terms of a rhetorical sense, there's a lot of holes in the dragon story. And I think the first one is, so they killed the dragon. Well, they still all died from natural causes. So the dragon's cancer. The dragon is some other, could be war, famine, the Holocaust. It could be Hitler. Actually, I kind of like Hitler because it had the train car analogy. You kill it, that's great. They still all die. Well, so there's there's that. Now
that's not giving enough justice to the story, let's be honest, because really it's supposed to be a metaphor around the idea of conquering death. That's how it was specifically written. And so it's easy to just bypass and say, oh, you can take the dragon notion and make it into any kind of tragedy or catastrophe, but it was written specifically to be an acknowledgement of how people perceive the inevitability of death and can potentially try to fight against it. And the juxtaposition of the ridiculous nature of humans accepting a dragon as the finitude of their life with the currently normalized notion of people accepting death through the reduction of telomeres and deterioration of their bodies leading to chronic illnesses or eventually just to death, as being just as presumptuous.
So the second point I would make is, what good came of it? I'll stick with the story. So what good came of it?
People had an opportunity to live, to explore genuinely what it means to be alive without having to couch that in there being a necessary ending.
That's my challenge to that is that's a very singular look at good. It's good for the individual. It's maybe good for the community in a moment in time, but is it good? Is it good for society? Now, you can make arguments that it is and it is not, right? But is it good? Is it?
Well, that's what I want to get into, right? That's going to be the meat of this conversation.
And I think that's really where the story, I think, falls short, because it doesn't talk about, well, sure, it's a fact, it happened. Now they don't have to worry about that. Well, that's great. I mean, for the individual, on the individual level, here a very individualistic approach. That's wonderful for those of them who wanted it dead. Now, the argument is, the discussion is, well, sure, maybe we can do this. Maybe science can do this. Sure, maybe perhaps it can. I think the first step is to get into an agreement that it can. Now, we may never will get there, because the weight of death, that Steve, you mentioned, the weight of death is not felt by people. Maybe you feel the weight of death, but I don't feel the weight of death. I know people on their deathbed don't feel the weight of death. Oftentimes they're very happy to be dying. Oftentimes the people beside them, well, they're sad, they're happy that these people. Now you could talk about religion and how it's leading us down a false sense of but the weight of death, I don't think really exists in the way it did in the story, that weight of death. So that's the fact that it doesn't exist.
I think that's individually specific, right? But go on.
But I think generally it's true. I mean, do you feel a weight of death? I'm interested.
I think that death is such a far off abstract concept that it's difficult to quantify how much it affects my life on the day to day. But I know that there have been times, especially when I was younger, that I've had difficulty grappling with the notion of the finiteness of my own existence. And I think that notion pervades our culture and also shapes the way that we live our lives.
Mm-hmm. And that's where I think it's a really amazing thing. I think the fact that we have this end point, and actually many scholars, if you look at the kind of the history of the research of death and the many famous philosophers talking about death, it's often in celebration. And if you look at it from a scientific perspective as well, from a socio perspective, from an economic perspective, it actually is often a very powerful, good thing.
How's that?
What happens when you get older?
Oh, this one. You're talking about the fact that people's ideas ossify, that it becomes more difficult for them to change their ideas, and typically most progress happens when a newer generation comes up. Is that what you're talking about?
Always. If you look at the arc of history, yes, that is what I'm talking. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Now, if you can talk about letting people live forever, but at the same time somehow modifying their brains so that they're open to new ideas, well, maybe it would be a good thing. But then you're down a very slippery slope, and I know slippery slopes are always a bad argument, but it is a slippery slope because when you start modifying that part of the brain, what else happens, and then we have to modify another part of the brain to counteract that, and another part of the brain to counteract that, etc.
So two arguments that you're making. The first one is that having an endpoint in life might actually provide some value at the individual level and provide people meaning. The second point being, at a societal level, the progression of ideas has always been caused by the birth of new generations, correct? So let's tackle both of those things separately. So the first one is the idea. Sorry, I have to drink my cough medicine, alcohol. So the first one is that the finiteness of life gives it value. And my main concern with this is that we are fundamentally stealing agency from people. If the idea is that immortality is actually possible, then isn't the greatest form of agency to give people a choice of when they are going to die? So many people, it's easy to use anecdotal evidence to say certain people feel fulfilled at the end of their life. Many people don't feel fulfilled at the end of their life. And saying that an arbitrary, what is it going to be, 80 years, 100 years? Maybe technology advances and we'll say 120 years is a good life. Maybe it's 150 if we're really good at addressing certain chronic diseases and can face the ones that come after that. Is it that the currently set lifespan of a human being necessarily constitutes a good life? What if we expand that to 300 years or 400 years? When is it too long, right? That line is very difficult. It used to be 50 years, right? It's not anymore.
Can I
and
interrupt
back
really
then,
quickly,
people would say that as a good life.
So
Sure.
really quickly, just on that point, I want to be clear. We're not talking about if living longer makes you happier. That's not what we're, just to clarify. Now, it could be that you could have a very fulfilled life living for 5 years. It could be you have a very fulfilled life living 100 years, but you could also equally have a very awful life living 10,000 years for 10,000 years.
Correct, but what I'm saying is that people should have a choice. If it was possible, giving people the agency to choose when they die, I don't see a greater freedom than that. And I don't see why that would be a negative. To constrain them by their biology, if there was a potential to lift that burden, does not seem preferable in any such way.
Okay, so
because people can choose that they've had a fulfilled life and choose to die.
The second point?
Oh, the second point, the societal point. Yeah, so this is also a really interesting point. It's an important point because I can't give you a definitive reason as to why ideas wouldn't ossify and become stagnant over time. It's the same thing. It's the same reason as why I couldn't give you a good reason why wealth inequalities wouldn't increase over time with an unequal distribution of immortality supplements or whatever they were. Life extension supplements.
I prefer
or however
injections.
it turns out, right? So I'm not saying that things are necessarily going to be better right away. What I'm saying is that expanding people's lives gives them an opportunity to innovate for longer. One of the biggest issues right now we have in human innovation is that an individual will learn so many techniques over their lifetime, and then they'll have to transfer those techniques onto another individual who will have to stumble through learning them again. What if humans were able to innovate for longer because they could live healthy lives for longer? That could help us address a lot of the potential issues that could come from something like overpopulation or something like the stagnation of ideas. Just the mere exposure to new research innovation that's possible because people can live longer and extend the lifetime in which they can be productive. Sure, go ahead.
So I think we're kind of gelling around these two ideas. That one, it's about a question of agency, and two, it's a question around social improvement over time.
Yes.
So would you agree? Okay.
Yes, I would agree with that.
So on the agency point, I'm going to start with the second point first. So Steve mentioned, and he didn't say this explicitly, but he said there's no evidence that that society would improve quickly or over the short run, and maybe and kind of hinting that it would over the long run. But and he talked about Steve, you talked about the fact that people could innovate for longer if they stayed alive longer. Well, I think that might be a little bit of a flawed logic model, because it assumes a couple things. It assumes that life is finite. Well, for an individual it is, but we have thousands of generations. We have billions of people. People are not finite resources. Life is not a finite resource on Earth as we understand it. It's unlimited practically. I mean, there are billions and billions of people that have come up with good ideas. So this idea that you can't innovate, you can innovate longer if you stay alive longer, I mean, it kind of suggests that, there's limited people to innovate. But there's not. I mean, there's billions of people to innovate. The second part of that is this idea that you can innovate if you stay alive longer, and you can innovate better if you stay alive longer. And I would suggest that actually the transfer of knowledge, and research, I believe, suggests this is true, the transfer of knowledge from one generation to the next leads to better ideas, because you're taking one set of value systems and trying to transpose it to a new set of value systems, and that transposition, that's where the magic happens. That's where new ideas happen. It's the change from one state to another, from one ossified senses and ideas to another. Now, maybe an individual or two, if they stayed alive longer, they'd come up with a couple of other ideas. But another one of the billions of people will come up with that idea within a couple hundred years. I mean, time is unlimited. So that idea that it's going to improve, I mean, I just don't buy it. I mean, it could improve, it could not. I don't think it has any edge over a finite life. I mean, I just don't see the logic model to suggest that it would.
No, that's totally fair, and I haven't given any reason to believe that at a societal level there's any strong evidence that immortality would lead to further technological development. I think that, well, I'm not actually sure. It would be interesting to look into the research around whether increased lifespans independent of well, you can't really look at research that in the effect of increased lifespans because it's so heavily coupled with economic and medicinal developments. So I guess that would be a difficult study to go into. It would be interesting if any of that's been attempted to be pieced apart, but of course I can't really speak to any of
So,
that kind
so
of thing.
I want to go on the point number one. So point number two is we're not sure, could or could not. So a draw. I think point number one, the agency, is really where it's a very poor idea because essentially, and we've had this discussion before, Steve, but essentially when you have limited resources, what happens? What happens when you have a limited resource of gold? What happens? Everyone wants it. Everyone needs it.
Yeah, a natural hierarchy develops.
Exactly. So say now, gold is unlimited. Gold's now the U.S. dollar. It's everywhere. You can get it anywhere, right? It's easy to get. It could be like rocks, and like if you have more and more, you do even better. But it's still like dollars. It have some currency. You'd want to save it up, right? Right? Because people like to have stuff, have things, and it gives them status. You know, if you have a lot of stuff, it gives you status. So everyone's going to want that life. Everyone's going to want it, right? Now, well, we can go into the whole argument of whether or not it's affordable or not, and the economic inequality that it causes. But I think that's a pretty obvious argument, so we don't have to get into it. But the fact of the matter is that you're going in from one sense of no agency from Steve's perspective. Steve, is saying, well, people don't have agency on when they die or not. Well, I would say they do because they can choose to exercise or eat well. Well, then you could say, well, they actually don't have agency in that because it depends on their socioeconomic status. Well, it's the exact same thing with longevity, right? So say now anyone who wants to can live for as long as you want. Well, who in society is going to have more status? It's these people with more stuff, a longer life. So now everyone wants to live longer. You're not giving people agency, just like capitalism doesn't really give people agency. You're just creating a new system into which people are trying to achieve a certain set goal. You're not giving people agency
So wait,
in any sense.
So your argument is that if people have the ability to live longer, they will choose to live longer purely for the status that it provides?
That's what people do, Steve. They do things to achieve social status.
First off, there's no evidence of that, right? And then
Steve, I'm sorry. There's no evidence that people do things to look better in other people's eyes. What?
No, there's no evidence that.
I'm sorry, but really, that's the whole point of living, is to look better than the next person. It's to accumulate more.
So are you saying that
better.
living itself is fundamentally flawed and that we shouldn't hold value in it?
Well, it's completely. I mean, yes. It is what it is.
That people shouldn't be able to choose how long they live because otherwise we would end up with an arbitrary hierarchy of value. Because here's the issue that I have with that, right? Fundamentally what we're saying, and this is the same argument because I think that Scott is putting up a much more nuanced argument than this, but in case people listening would bring up this argument, I think this is a really similar argument to the one that says, oh, but there'll be an unequal distribution of immortality supplements or whatever it is, and it would be distributed to wealthy people first, and they would get all of the advantage and the power and more money and more status and more wealth and everything and land, and it'll just exacerbate inequality. And this is the same thing that happens with any new technology. In the beginning, it's very expensive. And then over time, people innovate, it improves, and the price drops and more people can participate and consume that product, right? And this is a really important point because what we're talking about right now is the ability to choose to live forever, right? So there's one side of the argument which says we shouldn't pursue extension of life because a few wealthy people will have it before everybody else. And the other side that says there are inequalities that will inherently build because of the production of this. But at the end of the day, over time, more people will be able to live for a longer amount of time. Will be able to choose when they die. Will be able to live, in their minds, fully fulfilled lives. That's so important. And so the idea of bringing inequality into this is saying that all of us should live at a worse standard of living because I'm too afraid to allow certain people to improve their lives more than me or
Steve,
than the general public, right? And to me, that's a false notion, because at the end of the day, everybody's standard of living is going up. Everybody's getting an opportunity to live longer. Sure, some people will live even longer and exploit that, but at the end of the day, we're talking about death, right? Like, this is very important. This is a big point. Death, the end of your life. And to juxtapose the negative aspect of death versus some inequality, to me, is preposterous.
So, Steve, we'd already established that living longer or unlimited life doesn't actually improve one's well-being. We already discussed that.
How do you know that? Would you rather live for 50 years or 80 years?
I don't really care.
All else being equal.
I don't really care.
I would assume most people would say 80.
Especially
if that was 30 or 50.
I prefer more of how long do I suffer. Okay,
yeah, but that's a different question. That's a qualitatively different question, and that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about extending life, not extending suffering.
So, what Steve laid out was absolutely not my argument, so I'm not sure what that was all about. But my argument and my suggestion is going back to point number one, and again we are coalescing on 2 points here. The first point being agency, the second point being improvement to society. Now, the second point we agreed that it could not. It's ambivalent. We don't know whether or not it could or not. We don't know. We don't know. Now, we went off on a slight tangent about buying things like MacBooks, and then everyone feels like they need a MacBook, et cetera, et cetera. That's not my argument. That because everyone can get this pill if they have the money that they would, and they feel pressure to. That's not my argument. And no, I think it's a valid one because of exactly the point that Steve was talking about, in that it is death, and that if some people cannot afford to buy it, it would perpetuate vast inequality. It's not like buying a consumer product, right? It would perpetuate vast inequality, and it's unlikely that people in power would want that to trickle down, because we've seen that happening since the beginning of time, that people in power want to maintain power. People with all this stuff want to maintain that stuff. They don't want to give it to other people. But that aside, my argument is on point number one. It's not giving people agency. Because what would happen if everyone has access to this and you choose not to have access to it? Well, on the individual level, as Steve was saying, people want to live longer. So they'd accumulate more wealth. That's logical, living in our system. So if they choose to take this forever pill, and they live longer, they get a lot richer. So who, in their right mind, given that humans like to get ahead, they like to accumulate stuff, would want to choose the second option of dying early? So this idea that it's giving people agency is completely false. I mean, it's giving them a false sense of agency. So are you saying that
people will feel forced to live forever?
Do you feel forced to go to the bathroom inside of your own house? Do you feel forced to wear shoes? Do you feel forced? Yes, Steve. I mean, it's not agency. I mean, yes, it's many things. It's many things, but it's not agency. That's not what we're talking about here. It's not Apple. It's not MacBooks. It's not iPods that we're talking about. It's not agency. You're changing the paradigm. It is like Adam and Eve in a sense. It's saying, oh, now you're naked, and now you have to wear clothes. Do we have agency to go out and walk around naked in public? No, we do not. We'd get arrested. It's the same thing that you're suggesting. You would.
I do it every Sunday.
Okay, well, okay, maybe you do. It's not with a profound thing like this. It's not agency that you're giving people when you develop it. Just like when we look capitalist, just like Karl Marx was not giving people agency to opt in or out of the capitalist system. You're in it. If you're born in America, if you're born in a Western society, you're in that system. You want to opt out?
Okay. No, this is a
You
very
can
interesting
live.
point.
You can live poor for
I
your
think we're
whole
getting
life.
caught up.
It's not
So
agency.
I think you're making a very, very good point. I do believe that on the scale of agency, that if you have a choice of how long to live, that means you have more options to choose when you end that life, right? Naturally, in the same way that anyone can, you know, as morbid as it sounds, choose to end their life until, you know, whenever chronic illnesses.
Okay, but Steve, I'm
life
sorry.
for them.
I just want to interrupt really quick. So if that is the case, now let's talk in terms of billions of years. Let's talk in terms of billions of years. So, say a certain family, a certain individual ends their life earlier. It means they accumulated less wealth, right? Well,
Sure.
if you
On average.
right, on average they'll accumulate less wealth if they end their life earlier. So their children will have less wealth to start out with, and then if they live and live and live, compounding interest, they'll just be poorer. So I'm not talking about inequality. I'm not talking about the ability to afford this, but I'm talking about the forces that are would be pushing people to do this are not forces of agency. They're forces of, if I don't do this, I'll be giving my children less money. If I don't do this, people are going to frown on me because, why are you doing that? Why are you killing yourself early? Why would you do that? That's shameful. That's like suicide. That's suicide. We have agency every day of our lives. It's called suicide. We have agency in when to end our lives. Would you call that agency? Maybe. Is it positive agency? I don't know about that.
So you're saying that because of the treadmill, that people will be, forced to ride on, that people will live miserable existences feeling like they have no agency to end their life. That's most of your argument, right? First off, that one, a system of inequality based on wealth accrual is fundamentally inevitable and negative, right? That's going to be an ultimately negative system. Two, that people will feel social and economic pressure based on that to eke out an existence which they will fundamentally eventually find to be unfulfilling and miserable, right? And that because of these things, it is better that we don't search for life extension that could allow people to live forever, right? I find some holes in that argument.
Steve, let me finish my argument, okay? So we have 2 points. Steve just eloquently outlined the 2 points, and I completely agree with what he just said. So on point number 2, we don't know. It's a wash. Could be better, could be worse. On point number 1, agency, Steve just, I think he may slightly agree with me that it's not really.
No.
I'm
about to disagree.
It's not totally giving people the agency that was first promised because you have the pressure. Social pressure is not agency. It's not. Social pressure is not agency. So, you ask, what are the alternatives? Well, just imagine the cost, the vast amount of money, unbelievable amount of money that would go into this type of research. And then you say, well, we're doing it to make people better, to happier, because they'll be happier if they live longer. Well, if you look at it from a purely cost-benefit analysis, and you're trying to make people happier, because we don't actually think it's going to improve society, we don't actually know if it is or not, let's invest in something. Let's take that money and put it somewhere we know it'll have a much higher return.
Well, okay.
Put it into social services. Put it into universal basic income. Put it into things that actually increase people's life expectancies through ways that give them agency. Right? That has a strong ROI. It's been demonstrated. Why would you take that money and invest it somewhere else? In things that are unknown.
So several things.
And probably bad.
So several things. All right. First off, I think ultimately at the individual level, we went on and we've been discussing, and I'll continue to discuss my side of what I think of how immortality can promote agency. But at the individual level, even more important than agency, right, is a quality of life and experiential value, right? Agency is one part of that, right? But just as you were saying that people don't have certain forms of agency within a capitalist society, there are certain kinds of societies which promote certain levels of agency, but also certain qualities of life. And that also needs to be considered, right? So that's the first point. But with regards to agency, I think that it is a really dangerous assumption to say that because we have a natural system of competition within our economic environment and we have social pressures within our modern society, that if you extend life, it will force people to feel like they cannot end their lives peacefully, right? First off, we do not know what kind of cultural standards or context would be created from a life extension system, right? We don't know how people will react to being able to live 500, 1,000, 10,000 years into the future, right? It is presumptuous of us to take the way we currently live in a system in which we have a finite lifespan and extrapolate that into one with a longer lifespan, right? So we're still on the individual level. And the alternative, right, is saying that rather than giving us the opportunity to experience the benefits of that kind of technological innovation, we should prevent ourselves from allowing for the increasing of human experience. And that's what we're really talking about, right? At the end of the day, the most valuable, okay, this is going to be a tall order, and it can probably easily be argued against by philosophers, but the most important thing is human experience, right? All we know is that we are conscious, and what humans value within that is our own experience. Giving us a playground for having more of those experiences is one of, if not the most powerful way to do good for consciousness, to provide that playground, to provide that capacity, right? But I'm getting off topic. Yeah, go ahead.
So I just want to summarize. So progress in terms of society, probably a wash. Agency?
Well, I would like to go back to that.
Well, okay,
societal progress point,
hang on
actually.
a second. We
Yes.
kind of settled that. We can go back to it if we have time. We kind of settled that, self-admittedly, a wash. Agency, so-so, self-admittedly, you're taking away, you are not giving people as much agency as...
No. I'm definitely arguing that you get
okay,
more
perhaps
agency
you get more agency. Okay,
with
perhaps you
immortality.
get more agency. And perhaps people are happy when they execute that agency. Are people who commit suicide happy?
No, again, you're extrapolating current culture based on a finite lifespan.
Now,
I don't think
next
that's valid.
point, going off of what you just said, Steve, this idea that a long lifespan leads to increases in experiences. Steve, what's an experience?
Well, isn't that a very difficult thing to try to define?
Is washing the dishes an experience? In terms of how you define it.
Well, I think that, yes, it is an experience. Is it a memorable experience? There are gradations of experiences, and obviously we would like to promote positive and interesting experiences. That leads to complexity because sometimes the toughest trials end up being the most beneficial experiences to have. It's a complicated question.
So it's probably not a memorable experience. It's an experience, but it's not a memorable experience. Is driving to work a memorable experience? Probably not. Is traveling a memorable experience? Maybe, but if you travel for work, it's not a memorable experience. It's not. Experiences are rare. Memorable experiences are rare. The entire purpose of an experience is the scarcity of the experience. Life is memorable because it's scarce. So if you're talking about the quality of life, now there's other layers of this argument, of course, but if you're talking about the quality of life, Life is memorable because it's scarce.
This goes back to the
Every
dragon fable again.
but
By
Steve,
saying that we have
okay,
an arbitrary time limit on our lives, we are promoting a certain level of scarcity and therefore value.
okay, Steve, come up with an idea. Come up with an example where doing something a million times is still memorable and still fulfilling, besides masturbating.
The magical thing about human consciousness is that we are endlessly innovative in and find value in new things. If
Give me an
continue
example.
to innovate and find new value, then we can continue to have meaningful and fulfilling lives. And when that stops, you can choose to end it.
So give me an example.
How do you mean? Of an example of what?
Of something that's memorable when you do it a million times.
I'm not saying no. That's not a valid comparison, because what I'm saying is when people have an opportunity to live longer fulfilled lives, that's giving them an opportunity to have new experiences, to find value in those and do diverse things, not do the same thing over and over and over and over again. That would defeat the purpose.
So what you're saying, Steve, is when people are bored, being bored gives people agency to then kill themselves. See, I think that's a very sick and twisted argument. I say, so have as much fun as you can and then you can kill yourself. That doesn't sound like agency to me. It sounds like a roller coaster from hell.
Sounds better than having a preset end to your life that you have no control over. Especially because as we learn to tackle the problems that come up with life extension, we can find more sophisticated ways to handle the nuance around those kinds of arguments. The difficulty right now, the difficulty right now is that we're arguing about whether or not this life extension will lead to the kinds of utopian benefits that a lot of people who foolishly promote this idea tend to promote. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that having that option on the table will be hard. It will lead to new questions that we have to ask ourselves, but it will be worth it because ultimately we're extending human experience and we're extending the possibility for humans to be innovative and creative and to be able to build a better society. This is really similar in my mind. So in the 60s and 70s, massive population growth was happening. A guy called Paul Ehrlich came up with a book called The Population Bomb in 1968. So in it, he, with some very racist overtones, which we can try to ignore for now, stated that humans, like any other biological species, has a natural carrying capacity, and that we will eventually lead to our own self-destruction because we won't be able to feed ourselves given the limited food supply, and it will cause ultimate starvation, famine, and death. What happened was the Green Revolution, the advancement of artificial and synthetic fertilizers, as well as newly developed crop species, which massively increased the food supply globally. What I'm trying to say is that when humans encounter problems, we find solutions. And I like to believe in the fundamental optimism of human ingenuity, in that as complicated problems around immortality arise, we will find solutions. It's like saying we should prevent ourselves from certain kinds of technological innovation, and that to me is really dangerous, because if we can't believe in the optimistic nature of our own advancements, then what can we believe in for improving our society?
The reason we did not have a population bomb is because people die.
No, that's not true. There wasn't the kind of mass starvation that Paul Ehrlich hypothesized. Instead,
right,
there was a Green Revolution.
That's because of the demographic transition curve, which we don't have to get into now, which essentially is people have fewer children and then they get to the natural replacement rate because they're dying and having babies at the same rate. That's why, and the Green Revolution.
That's part of it.
Yes, that is.
But I think that if we hit that issue again, we will find a new technological solution to solve it.
But I would say the demographic transition curve is why we did not have mass starvation, because we had progress and people had. Anyway, it's a bit funny. I think it's a bit funny. But I want to say, Steve, this idea, you keep trying to equate this idea of living forever with other technological advances. And I think this is and this is a broader issue with society we don't have to get into now, but it's the idea that there's no gray. That if you say X is good, then Y is good. If you say A is good, then B is good. And C and D all the way to Z. If one thing is good, if progress is good in one sense, it's good in all senses. If progress is good in China, it's good here. If progress is good in the US, it's good there. It's good everywhere. And I think that's really dangerous because you must think of it relatively. You must think of it as gray. When we're talking about progress is a constructed notion. Many times in our history we have gone backwards in time. Is that progress? Maybe it was. We would say it's backwards. Other people would say it's progress. For example, Iran, the whole Muslim world, used to be light years ahead of Europe. Light years ahead of Europe in terms of technology. And then they regressed due to a variety of reasons. And I use that word regressed because I'm Western. Now, if you're a devout Muslim, you would say, no, we went back to the true Islamic faith and rejected all this newfangled stuff. What I'm saying is, when we talk about progress, we talk about it from a very specific viewpoint. And we say, oh, progress is good because progress is good. Maybe it doesn't improve people's lives, but progress is good because it gives people agency. Well, many people don't believe that. Many people think our version of progress, the version of progress Steve's talking about, that's not progress. That's going back in time. That's bad. It's not good. We shouldn't be doing that. Death is good. So what I'm saying, Steve, is that when you're equating living forever with other forms of progress, with forms such as the Green Revolution, such as the Apple MacBook, such as computers, such as the telephone, such as the Industrial Revolution, such as birth control, well, every single one of those people didn't think was progress. Now, it was progress because it was widely adopted, and people moved in that direction. But it was labeled progress only because people adopted it. If it was not adopted, for example, if birth control was not adopted, we may call birth control progress here. But in many parts of the country, in many parts of the world, birth control is not adopted. Birth control is not progress. It's important to put things relative. And the scale on which we're talking about, the scale of living forever, that cannot be equated and is not similar in any shape or form to any sort of progress that's ever happened on the face of this earth. Ever. So to equate it...
I'm not sure what your argument is.
What I'm saying, Steve, is that you keep saying it's better. Doing this will be better. You more agency. It's progress. It's moving things forward. We should do it because it's good. We should do it because we can. What I'm saying is, that's just your definition. You're saying we should do it because we can, just because you think we should move in that direction. There are many people who don't think we should do that, who think it would be a very bad idea, who don't think it's progress, who think it's going back in time. So
yeah, but that's like saying there's no such thing as truth, so why bother? And then I'm gonna go smoke some weed. It's really easy to throw up our hands with relativistic arguments and say that's really difficult to define one person's perspective of progress versus another and try to validate one over the other. What I'm trying to say is that there are certain measures granted within the confines of a Western modern society, post-industrial modern society that has certain fundamental doctrines and principles, right? That can include an assumption and expectation that economic growth will continue upward. It can also include the notion that science and technology can ultimately solve most of our problems, although that's been seen to be refuted by some who are looking for more spiritual alternatives, but
or
that's another
Trump.
thing. But then it's one. I'm willing to accept that I live within one certain perspective and worldview, and I'm defining my notions of progress within that. I'm also willing to say that certain forms, certain worldviews, based on fundamental principles like human rights, right, are probably not, should probably not be provided equal weight, right? Fundamentalist Islamic radical groups should not be given the same weight in the determination of what progress entails as Western secular scientifically driven society. Like, that's right. In the moral relativists around us would say, well, who knows, right? And it's really difficult to come up with a solid argument for saying this is true at a baseline level. But what I can say is that we have tangible metrics that we, at least in Western society, have determined to be of value, such as our infant mortality rate, such as life expectancy, such as obesity rates, such as rates of other chronic illnesses. And when those values for chronic illnesses and such go down, when infant mortality goes down, when life expectancy goes up, we tend to see that as progress, right? So that's the first point.
I'm not sure how that relates to immortality.
Well, I was trying to refute your notion that progress is always relative, right? I would disagree.
That's
at
true,
a
but again,
practical level.
That's true, Steve. But again, you're equating this idea of living forever to infant mortality. I don't see how they equate. That's what I'm saying. It's not the same. It's not. You can't say that it is the same as these other things. I don't get that connection.
So how many years of life is too much? Is it 100? Is it 150?
It's
160? How many?
It's the current life expectancy, which is supported by the current expenditures, which are going towards improving our lives. And I want to come back to this idea because I think it's very important that first of all, we don't know if improving our lives actually improved anything. We don't know that. And Steve will admit that himself. We don't know if it will actually improve anything. It improves the agency in a very narrow sense. In many senses, it does not.
No, it increases opportunities, which I think gives us a chance to improve our lives.
I'm not quite sure if it increases opportunities because of the ossification of oneself. I actually think it probably decreases opportunities in some cases because that you are now limited to a single choice. You get that or that, A or B. It's the grocery store of choice. You get A or B. I prefer
so let
to have
people
one
experience an inevitable death
ending
because they're starting to
choices.
become solid in their thinking strategies.
I didn't hear what you just said, but sure.
No. What I'm saying is, so it's justified to prevent people from being able to extend their lives because their thinking is now more ossified than it was before.
But you go back to the agency question. I mean, is it okay? So what? I mean, I don't know. So what?
So people's refusal to be
better.
open-minded is a reason for them to not have an extended life. Is that what it is?
I just don't understand. Like, how is it better? Like, how is it actually better? Or
because you get to live.
I don't understand how that's better if you get to just live longer for an unlimited amount of time. I don't understand how that's better.
Would you rather live to 10, to 20, to 30, or to 40? All else being equal.
40.
Exactly. All right, now let's extrapolate that into the future. And at some point, most people will say,
so
well,
now
that's probably
Steve is
going to
say that eventually I'll say that's too old, and I'll say, well, that's a social construct that's telling you that that's too old, and then maybe who is you to tell that that's too old? Well, it's society that's telling me it's too old. It's my body telling me it's too old. It's myself telling me it's too old. I'm expressing agency and saying that's too old. Now, if I had the option to live longer, we go back to the original argument. I would feel pressure to live
it's
longer.
also your body
when you
have smallpox telling you that it's time to die, excruciating and horrific death. But we solved that.
I think we're getting to the point of
But you get what I'm saying, right? Okay, so I do want to make this point before we get into generalizations. A lot of chronic illnesses today are just surface level issues with the root cause of your body just falling apart, your telomeres shrinking, your cells unable to clone correctly. This spawns things like cancer, Alzheimer's. We're putting in a lot of money to try to solve chronic issues without looking at the root level cause, which is that people just can't live longer, right?
I get that. Okay.
But this exposes a real issue with the idea of saying that we have natural lifespans, because we've always fought that. We've always fought against people dying. We've always fought against illnesses and diseases. And this is no different, in my opinion. It's no different.
But
aging is an illness.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's great. But I just literally at this point, I don't really see why it makes my life better. I just don't get it. I literally.
That's a more interesting philosophical debate. Yeah.
I literally don't see why it makes my life better to live longer. I'm very happy with myself. I'm very happy with the way I am right now. I'm very happy with my life. And I'm very happy to die at 90 years old. I don't have a drive to do that. Now, if I was presented with the option to have electricity, to not use candles, I'd love that. I mean, so I think there's progress. That's definitely, oh yeah, I would want that. But I just don't. I don't understand. And then I go to the point where I don't understand what the value is, given that I'm not convinced on the agency part, I'm not convinced on the progress part, I'm not convinced on increasing experiences part. Well, okay, then personally I go back to well, what else could I spend this money on? And I could think of 1,000,001 things where I could spend this money that would have a much bigger impact on people's lives that actually make a measurable positive impact that we know about. So personally, I would be of the mind to say, well, fix things here before we start living 1,000,000 years. Let's fix things here. Now, if we have every social ill cured here, then maybe we can talk about extending it. Maybe then people would have a nice time living longer. But if we can't fix what we got already, I don't know why the hell we'd want to extend it. I just don't know. It doesn't make sense to me. Let's fix what is here now.
So first off, I don't think it's an either-or argument, right?
Steve, if you understood economics, it is an either-or. It's cost-benefit. You have to know where to focus your energy. What you're talking about is not about inventing electricity.
I'm not saying that I don't understand basic economics. What I'm saying is that if you can increase awareness and shift people's perspectives toward valuing something like immortality research, you can find funding for it.
But why would I want to do that? Why would I put a big marketing campaign to shift people's perspectives for that?
Well, what I'm arguing against isn't that. What I'm trying to say is that one of your arguments was that it's an either or, that either we can research immortality or we can focus on short-term issues. And what I'm trying to say is that it doesn't necessarily have to be.
Well, it doesn't, but what I'm saying is, who would want to do that? I mean, right now, other than you and a couple select people, where's the interest? Where's the desire to do so?
Well, I assume, and maybe this is a big assumption, and maybe it's just me, who knows, but I assume that a lot of people just see death as this ultimately inevitable thing. They've accepted from a young age that they will die, and they've rationalized that. And by rationalizing, I also mean they haven't really truly thought through the implications of what that means. The end of an existence. Never having any thoughts, any experience, any of this. No more podcasts. Yeah, that's
Steve,
a sad
I
thought.
get that's scary. It's scary. I'm scared of it. But if I live forever, that's scarier to me. It is literally scarier for me to live forever than to die. I'm not kidding you. That.
Well, and this is coming to a personal preference point right now. And that's why I'm saying we should still all have a choice.
That is okay, sure. I mean that's again your perspective. That is your perspective, and I'll give that to you. And I think it's it's again a personal perspective preference, and I also think that if it was an option, that I would feel pressured to take it, and I would not feel agency in that decision.
I mean, we'd have to continue this podcast at least through 500 years.
Well, that's what I'm saying. But that's what I'm saying, Steve. Like you may feel agency, but I wouldn't feel agency. I'd feel like if I have that choice, I feel pressured to keep staying alive because you would want me to keep staying alive. I would feel pressure to do that. That for me is an agency.
Yep, and 200 to 300 years from now, we could try to address and reconcile and see how you feel about it then and figure out novel psychological solutions for how to cope with and manage that and see if society has changed to be more accepting to it. So at this point, I think I understand your argument. I think you've made a lot of good arguments. I still believe very strongly that there should be more research into immortality. And I do want to say thank you for humoring me on doing this podcast episode. Part of it is hopefully that some people somewhere will listen to this and a small fraction of those people will agree with what I've said and be smart enough to start working on this problem.
And I want to wrap up by saying there was a very recent story about a scientist in China who was working on some genetic modifications and nothing to the extent of this. And as soon as people figured it out, he was shut down by the global community in 2 seconds by some very liberal scientists saying, no, you can't do that. My point being that regardless of whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, and we don't know, it's a personal preference, progress is determined by society. And if society is not ready for it, and it's not, and it may not be for another 500 years, then you shouldn't push the point. Because when you push the point, usually things go backwards.
That's what they said about slavery. All right, well, let's not get into another conversation.
That's a wrap.
And that's where we'll end this podcast. I'm sorry. Okay, we will be gone for the Christmas break, and then we'll hopefully have an episode. We're going to try something new. I mean, this is only our second episode, but we're going to try to do a book club. So we will be reading a book, and then we will be discussing it over one or several episodes. So, Scott, you want to talk about the book?
Yeah, so it is called The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, who is a really famous author. She's written a lot of books on pressing current issues. She's a journalist. She's actually won a ton of accolades. She's won several awards. She's quite objective. This book specifically, I'm going to read off the back here so I paraphrase it correctly. So it's a groundbreaking alternative history of the most dominant ideology of our time, free market economics. And in this book, the author challenges the myth that the movement really was a peaceful global victory, right? So free market spread peacefully throughout the world, and everyone likes the free market. And she shows in this book and demonstrates through journalistic stories that actually that was not the case, that it's extremely under these extreme circumstances where free market economics are actually pushed upon other countries. And actually, this interestingly relates to our debate, this idea of agency and free choice being free market is seen as a free choice. Well, in fact, it was pushed upon many countries and many people, many individuals, usually by the United States. So I think given the modern times, given that a lot of people are talking about democratic socialism, which is actually just still capitalism, essentially, and that Europe has this huge populist movement. It's an interesting book to be reading, even though it's a couple of years old. I think 2007 is when it was published. So we'll be talking about that next time.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Scott.
All right, Steve. Until next time.
See you next time.